Israel is becoming increasingly isolated. As you all know, the war with Gaza has spread much further than anyone could have imagined. The hostages have taken a backseat, and everything points to the Israeli army being more focused on conquest than on carrying out an anti-terrorist operation. This explains news stories such as this one.
France joins the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Canada in recognizing the Palestinian state.
Israel is losing many of its historic allies, and we're not just talking about rhetoric. I know that world leaders have gotten us used to saying they're deeply concerned and then carrying on as if nothing happened, but this time things are much more serious. We're already seeing military contracts cancelled, Israelis banned from all sorts of events, and even excluded from bidding on certain government contracts. You could say that right now, the only major power that continues to support the Jewish state without much nuance is the US. And take note, because Americans are also beginning to be fed up. According to a survey, 53% of Americans have a negative image of Israel, 10% more than a couple of years ago. Furthermore, Netanyahu is losing supporters among both Democratic and Republican voters. Of course, they are well aware of this in Tel Aviv. They know that the new maneuvers in Gaza, and not only in Gaza, are not going to win them many fans. And, as was to be expected, Netanyahu has a plan. A plan so simple and radical that it has set off all the alarms.
We will increasingly need to adapt to an economy with autarkic characteristics. This technical term is the word I most hate. I am a believer in the free market, but we may find ourselves in a situation where our arms industries are blocked. In a scenario of Athens and Sparta, Israel will have to become Athens and Super Sparta. There's no choice. In the coming years at least, we will have to deal with these attempts to isolate us. What has worked until now will not work from now on.
It couldn't be clearer. If the rest of the world turns its back on Israel, Israel will do the same. It will become Sparta itself, or better yet, Super Sparta. And don't think that the Israeli Prime Minister was addressing a particularly radical group of voters. Not at all. Bibi was addressing business people, politicians, and treasury officials. We're talking about autarky, the North Korean model, which, in a country as small and dependent on the outside world as Israel, could be economic suicide. So the questions are clear. How serious was Bibi with this speech? How would this economic shift affect his land of startups? Could we be looking at a new crisis in Israel? This is what we're about to get into in this video. You've heard Netanyahu. He's a fan of the free market, but he's being forced to shut down the country, even though he doesn't like it. And do you know who else doesn't like it? The market. Following these statements, the Tel Aviv 35 fell 1.43%, and the Tel Aviv 125 fell 1.6%, even though it had already been falling 0.5%. Are we talking about apocalyptic results? Well, let's not get carried away. But the message is clear, not this way. The Gaza war is already extremely expensive. Military spending as a percentage of GDP has doubled, and the Bank of Israel estimates that the war will cost $67 billion by 2025 alone. Israel is still far from the peak of 30% military spending reached during the 1970s, but even so, we must not lose sight of one thing. This war is already the most expensive in Israel's history. But take note, because direct military spending is not the only expense, nor even the most significant one. Much more expensive is the fact that the country's workers have to leave their jobs to serve in the army. That is, if they don't flee the country first. To give you an idea, since the outset of the war in Gaza, some 85,000 workers from technology companies have left Israel.
The prohibition on Palestinian workers entering Israel reduced the labor supply in the business sector by 3.4%, and the transition of personnel to reserve service reduced it by about 1.5%.
In short, the war in Gaza makes less and less sense. Meanwhile, it's becoming increasingly expensive, and now Netanyahu is directly threatening the war economy. I'm sure you can understand the uproar these statements have caused.
The policy of the government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu is leading the state of Israel to a dangerous and unprecedented economic and diplomatic nadir. We are not Sparta. This vision, as presented, will make it hard for us to survive in a developing, globalized world.
And it's no wonder. Israel is a country of startups, of garage companies that become true global giants. And do you know how many of those giants a country like North Korea has produced? No need to look it up on Wikipedia. 0. But it doesn't end there. On paper, Israel has a fairly small trade balance. It exports between 3 and 4% of its GDP, which isn't that much. However, things are not that straightforward. You can have a trade balance very close to zero, either because you export and import very little, or, on the contrary, because you do both in industrial quantities, and they offset each other. This is precisely the case with Israel. Tel Aviv exports 32% of its GDP, and imports around 28.5%, meaning it's completely dependent on foreign trade. What's more, Israel's advantage lies in high value-added services such as finance, cybersecurity, and telecommunications. To give you an idea, last year's exports of services were almost double those of imports, around $85 billion compared to just $45 billion. However, in terms of capital goods, the Israeli economy is very, very dependent on foreign raw materials and machinery. Remember, Israel does have natural gas, but it needs to import all the oil it consumes on a daily basis, around 250,000 barrels per day. And of course, in an autarky, if you don't have basic resources guaranteed, then you can forget about producing high value-added services. It would be like putting the cart before the horse. Besides, who are you going to sell to? But don't think that we're only talking about an economic problem. Far from it. Israel is a very rich country, yes, but it has the same surface area as El Salvador. No matter how high a country's GDP per capita may be, in the end, what matters in the military arena is total firepower. And here, the key to Israel's survival has a name: the United States of America. Since the end of the Second World War, Israel has received more aid from Uncle Sam than any other country. We're talking about $320 billion adjusted for inflation, of which about $225 billion has been direct military aid. Since the attacks on October 7th alone, Tel Aviv has received 57,000 artillery shells, 36,000 rounds of ammunition for cannons, 20,000 M4A1 rifles, 14,000 anti-tank missiles, and we could go on like this all day. That's just since October 7th. To this entire list, we must add 334 fighter jets, such as the famous F-35, which it already had in its arsenal. And let's not forget the aid in dollars. More than $10 billion in spare missiles for the Iron Dome, ammunition factories, and advanced weapons development. Anyway, I think the message is clear. Not only does the Israeli economy depend entirely on the outside world, but its very survival is at stake. Of course, you could say that Bibi shouldn't be taken literally, that he wasn't referring to autarky like North Korea's. In fact, that's exactly what he said to calm the waters when his previous speech set off all the alarms.
There has been a misunderstanding, Netanyahu said, arguing feebly that the only area in which Israel risked isolation was in arms manufacturing. He reiterated that he had full confidence in the country's economy, and he hailed foreign investments. He didn't mention that per capita growth rates in Israel have been negative for 2 years running.
Basically, what has always been known as backtracking. And don't get me wrong, it's clear that Bibi never intended to turn the land of startups into a cheap copy of North Korea, but he certainly wasn't referring only to the arms sector, where we've already seen a high dependence on the US. But do you know what? The truth is that the Israeli government doesn't need to declare any kind of autarky to lead the country into recession. A bigger one than the one it's in now, I mean. After the attacks on October 7th, GDP fell by nearly 20%, which is truly outrageous. Of course, Israel became a country at war, so this is not so unusual. Nor is it surprising that the economy rebounded quickly. We've seen this with Putin's Russia. During wars, government spending becomes a GDP-generating machine. Keep in mind that generating GDP is not the same as generating well-being. Although GDP grew by 0.9% in 2024, business production fell by 0.8%. And yet, the economy contracted again in the last 2 quarters. What was supposed to be a lightning war to rescue the hostages and wipe out the terrorists has turned into a much more entrenched conflict. Even so, this is not what worries the government's economic team the most. This war has the potential to weigh down the economy, not for a few years, but for a whole decade. Keep in mind that there's already a precedent. Between approximately 1973 and 1985, the Israeli economy suffered the greatest crisis in its history, the lost decade, about 10 years without economic growth. The reason? Well, the origin is very clear: the Yom Kippur War. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking. Well, let's see. If you're at war for 10 years, it's to be expected that the economy will not grow. Israel couldn't do any better. But make no mistake, the Yom Kippur War did not last a decade or even a year. It lasted only 19 days. Okay, it's true that wars don't appear out of nowhere overnight, nor are they completely buried with a treaty. But one thing is clear, such a short event could cause a recession, similar to the 2008 crisis in Spain. And you know what they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. During the last decade, inflation reached 445%, and it's estimated that it would have broken the 1000% barrier had it not been for the 1985 stabilization plan. With this plan, the public deficit was cut from 16% of GDP to just 1.3%. We're talking about an even bigger cut than Poland's when it abandoned communism. But for this stabilization program to be successful, economists highlight two key points. 2 points that, right now, are conspicuous by their absence in Israel. First is political consensus. The Stabilization Pact was an agreement between politicians from all parties, but also between businesses and workers to limit wages and benefits, and thus avoid an inflationary spiral. However, these days, Parliament is completely fragmented. Netanyahu has barely managed to get the 2026 budget passed, and he's done so by making concessions to a host of lobbies, especially radical ultra-orthodox ones. And the second point is, of course, foreign aid.
Without this aid, more stringent and probably less feasible fiscal adjustments would have been required to achieve the same degree of disinflation that was observed ex post. In this context, an important role was played by the special foreign aid received from the United States, amounting to $1.5 billion in 1985 and 1986.
Once again, the move to isolate itself from the international community could backfire badly on Tel Aviv. That said, there's no need to sound the trumpets of doom. The Yom Kippur War was a key trigger for this crisis. That much is clear. After all, military spending reached 30% of GDP. But this episode is far from being the only cause. In general, Israel's problem is that they became overconfident. The economy was booming, so politicians decided to start spending government money freely. To give you an idea, the state's share of GDP reached 75%. Yes, you heard correctly, 75%. And we're not talking about military spending. Welfare payments, subsidies to companies, public sector salaries, interest on the debt, all expenditure skyrocketed. Of course, that's how they reached a 16% deficit. But the debt became completely unsustainable. The banking sector collapsed, and the rest, well, you know the story. We're not in that situation today. The war in Gaza is very expensive, yes, but Israel is spending only a third of what it did during the lost decade on military spending, and the rest of the budget items are much more controlled. Nevertheless, this episode is a reminder of where the Israeli economy could go if Netanyahu gives in to his darkest impulses. But now, it's your turn. Do you think Bibi was serious about his Super Sparta speech? Could Israel survive as an autarky? Will it manage to change course, or will we see another lost decade? You can leave your answers down in the comments. Don't forget that here on Visualeconomik we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you liked this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you next time.